Thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak today, particularly Greening Australia for giving me the opportunity to come over here, and particularly Annabelle for the invitation to be part of this workshop and the last couple of days. I'm a livestock producer from over at Gundagai, 2 hours west of Canberra in the foothills of the Snowy Mountains. And today I'm going to give you a little bit of background for what we do over there. Talk about some of the challenges that we face, but I actually feel that all livestock producers, be they pastoralists or sheep farmers, face. Talk about some international things I saw overseas around environmental stewardship schemes. So that's paying land managers to deliver environmental outcomes. It might be more carbon, protection of native vegetation, improving wildlife numbers, quality of water. And then briefly touch on some opportunities. This is home for me, where as I said, in the foothills of the Snowy Mountains, it's about 650 mils or 26 inches if you're more comfortable with that. We run one beast to the acre on river flats, but up on the hills we're back to one beast to say 5 acres, just to try and give you some context over here in the Pilbara. Look, the other day we were doing some renovations at home, and I pulled up for a cup of tea, opened up and as part of that we were replacing the carpet, replacing the roof, replumbing the house. Expensive exercise. Reading the Sydney Morning Herald, and these were the headlines. There you can see drought, mining, immigration, Western Australia agitating to seed. You guys seem to comes around all the time, and rain had interrupted the play at cricket. The interesting thing about this is that newspaper was written in the 1930s. It was actually under the carpet in the house. So, next one, Pip, please. So the issues that we face in Australia today aren't materially changed from back then. But we've got a whole lot more tools at our fingertips to better manage the way that we do things. And to my mind, that's one of the great opportunities of a workshop like this, is to share those ideas and cross-pollinate, if you like. So back in those days, and this is a picture of my grandfather and his brother, the government obligated them to clear if they were to continue farming in that landscape. Had we brought in a carbon trading scheme, I would have been obligated 2 generations later to plant trees back into that landscape. So sometimes we can make some hasty decisions that at the time might be seen as appropriate, but the longer term impacts are quite serious. And then of course they set about trying to grow crops, probably in country that wasn't best suited. But you can see there he's an early innovator. It's a low carbon emission tractor, 5 horsepower. And then try and produce crops, and they were challenged by, I guess, their ability to do things at scale. So infrastructure, land tenure, bulk handling of grain, interestingly, water conservation and irrigation, they were challenges back then, and research, development and education. They were the things that my grandfather wrote about back in the 30s. So a little bit about us. Our farm background, it's a family farm, sheep, cattle and wool. So we produce, say, a 400 kilo beast in about 14 months. And that's black cattle. And one of the challenges we've got is competing land use demands. So there's an expectation over in our part of the world, and I suspect increasingly here too, that we will not only produce food and fibre, but it'll be green, it will be clean, and that we'll at the same time manage the environment. So we're being asked to actually, more often than not, do more with less. And I actually see that as a risk to us as an industry, because if we as an industry don't get on the front foot and proactively come up with solutions, then someone else is going to advocate on our behalf, and it won't necessarily look and feel like what it is that we need to actually be able to do that job properly. So that risk is actually climatic risk, production risk, financial risk, and also the regulatory environment. So what we're endeavouring to do on our place is create an adaptive and resilient landscape. And for us, our farm program is we identify our land according to its productivity. So you can see here on the low-lying areas, we've planted crops, and we'll move into perennial grasses a little later on. And this sort of country, we can probably run not quite one beast to the acre on that. And then on the hills, we're actually trying to recruit native perennial pastures through our grazing systems. And that white grass that you can see there is actually last year's red grass, which is a native perennial. It's highly adapted to the landscape. It tolerates saline conditions, drought, grazing, and if we ever had sufficient funds, we could fertilise it, but it's a long time since anyone's put fertiliser out on the hills. We used to fly it out with an aeroplane, but it costs a mozza to do it. So we use grazing management not only to recruit pastures, but also for weed control. And we've already heard today, the last two speakers have spoken about how that's part of their system. And I'm sure for many of you, it may also be part of yours. We revegetate degraded sites, and we also manage good remnant vegetation to deliver enhanced outcomes. So it might be greater diversity around plants, or it might be better habitat for wildlife. And we fence, as I said, according to land class. So there's actually a fence around the bottom here. We can graze this in spring and early summer, then we're off the hills because we don't want it to be overgrazed, and we don't want it to erode, and also to have weeds in there. We had a bushfire through there 18 months ago, burned about a third of the property, and I made a conscious decision to get in there and spray it. That was a helicopter job at $30 a hectare, for them to do the spraying plus chemicals. But it really slows down our ecology and our productivity if we overgraze and allow weeds back into the landscape. So fence according to land class, but traditionally a lot of this area, they had hill and flat in the land, in a paddock, because the stock would go to the hills to camp at night and then come down to graze the flats during the day. But the trouble was, you either had to flog the hills to use all the flats, or underutilise the flats to protect the hills. Whereas now we can really focus what we do. So, what are the benefits? To me, I like making a profit, and I'm in business to make a buck. But I'm also in business I care about the landscape, and I care about the environment. So we're about producing food and fibre and ecological goods and services. Our productivity, our production has probably increased by about 15% just by changing the way we undertake our grazing systems. But I'd estimate that on those flats, we've doubled our carrying capacity, and on the hills we've probably increased it by 30%. So as you all know, land is valued based on how many stock units you can carry. So not only are we getting increased cash flow, and should I manage it well in any one year, increased profit, but also the capital value of our assets going up because we're able to run more livestock. But we've also got a more resilient farm system. We've got those native perennials in the landscape that are highly adapted, and they'll respond well to rainfall events. And we've also seen from an environmental perspective, an ecological perspective, the understory's returned. We've got shrubs that grow a couple of metres high that as a kid I don't remember them ever being there because those paddocks were set stocked, whereas now there's, in an area this big, there might be a dozen of them growing. And landscape gardeners in Sydney and Melbourne love them because they're quite colourful. They're a legume, and they're grey bush pea, and obviously stock love them because they're a legume, but landscape gardeners will pay you $4,000 a kilo for the seed because they can use them as ornamental plants. Not a high priority for us to commercialise that, but it might be for someone else. And we're also seeing threatened and endangered species, so the swift parrot coming back into the environment because we're creating a habitat for that. We've got universities and CSIRO coming and doing the monitoring and evaluation, so we can actually stand there and say, yes, we are improving the ecological health of the landscape at the same time as we're improving the productivity. And probably one of the greatest things is we are working towards continual ground cover, which is about water utilisation. And I know we've already touched on it a bit today, and we'll be hearing far more about it over the next day or so, which enables us also to mitigate erosion and manage weeds. So, change is always a challenge. And one of the greatest impediments to change, from a survey that was done amongst farmers over in the eastern states, was a lack of funds. The next thing was low commercial benefits. So why would I do it if there's not a clear cost benefit there, unless I've either got, you know, incredible personal wealth or philosophically driven. You know, we are still in the business of farming, and so we need to. You've all heard it before. It's very hard to be green if you're not in the black. Government policy constraints, 61% of farmers said that was an impediment to change. To me, the biggest one though is a lack of options of demonstrating success. So I could have sat here today and talked theoretically about what we did on our farm, but by actually putting some images up there, at least it's kind of creating a bit of a picture. Better yet, I'd walk you out onto the farm and show you what's happening. And to my mind, that'll be one of the great things that happens here this afternoon and tomorrow, is to be able to walk out there, kick the clods, talk about things, and actually see how it's applied in the landscape. And then the final one was a lack of information. So armed with all of those challenges, I headed off overseas to look at ecosystem services. Oh, there we go. So there's all the detail on that. We've rattled that one off. So next one, Pip. So ecosystem services, as pastoralists, you know, food, obviously not fibre in this part of the world. I run sheep, David. I love sheep. In case you didn't know, their brain is in their tail, and you cut that off every time you mark them. So that's why they're a bugger to run. But over in the eastern states, and obviously the higher rainfall areas, you're talking about wool, cotton, and other fibres. And then there's all these other attributes that are present in our farming systems. It's just to what extent are you necessarily managing for them? Is there a commercial opportunity there, or cost benefit in actually putting your finite resources into doing that? Is that a high priority? And so for me, it was, how can we find solutions where consumers will reward land managers for delivering some of these outcomes? So quickly, the best one I saw was the Watershed Agricultural Council, New York City, 9 million people. We're going to spend $8 billion on a water treatment plant and $1 million a day to run it. And this is 20 years ago, so think about the costs today. There's 300 farmers up here in the Catskill Mountains, and they're row croppers and dairy farmers, so very intensive agricultural systems. A lot of inputs into that. They get 3 months of snow every year, so you can imagine mucking your dairy shed out onto snow would be a bit like putting it onto asphalt. You get a rainfall event, straight into the river system. And the reason for putting in the upgrading the water treatment plant is that from those nutrients, there's a build-up of Cryptosporidium and Giardia, which is some pretty nasty tummy bugs. Any of you that travelled through Southeast Asia, you've probably had a dose of those. So they were keen to mitigate those risks. These farmers saw that if they didn't move, they didn't get on the front foot and come up with a solution, they would be regulated, and it would constrain what they could do, and it would impact their bottom line. So they got up there and said, we will voluntarily plant buffer strips around all of the streams or all of the water systems to reduce nutrient runoff. And that would filter it so that the water, by the time it got into the waterways, was sufficient that it didn't require all of this engineering solution. And they also stored their manure over winter in these big holding tanks, and then in summer they spread it as a fertiliser. And they were paid according to how many acres they had in the program and how many livestock they had in it. And they said to New York City, that'll cost you $7 million. So 9 million residents, $7 million, less than $1 per resident per annum. New York City got a solution that cost the equivalent of 1 week's running cost of that new treatment plant. These guys up here get an annuity. It doesn't matter what happens with commodity prices. It doesn't matter what happens with the weather. It doesn't matter what happens with the economy. And they had to spend it on what was going in the Catskills. So it might have been the ability to buy a new tractor and a lease payment. It might have been some fencing. It might have been some pasture improvement. It might have been something to do with earthworks. They couldn't spend it skiing in Aspen or holidaying in Florida. And they've been so successful now that they eco-label everything coming out of there as pure Catskills, and New York residents and others will drive on this food trail up there to buy their clotted cream and their raspberries and what have you from that area. So that was a great one. Another one was Samsø Island in Denmark. There's 4,000 residents on this island. They were given the challenge in '97 to become completely self-sufficient from an energy perspective over 10 years. It's an area of about 144 square kilometres, so obviously small by comparison here, but the beauty of it was quite bounded, and there was no other, they weren't up against another council, they weren't up against another nation where there might have been an impact. And at a cost of $82 million, 93% of which was tipped in by the people in the island, they moved to being completely self-sufficient. It involved windmills. Instead of each of them, obviously over there it gets pretty cold, we're in Denmark, instead of each of them having a heating unit in their house, what they did was they had a centralised one and then they piped it out to everyone. So all the farmers would contribute their waste and their leftover to this central heating unit, and then it got pumped out. They used biomass from canola. They were able to press the oil out of that and either utilise the oil for biodiesel, and then the cake, so the residue of that has a lot of nutritional value, very high protein, and so that was good for feeding the cattle. And they've subsequently set up an energy academy. So tourism is now their second big money spinner. Ducks Unlimited, that's an example where people pay a lot of money to come and shoot a duck. Any of you travelled to the States, they love their guns. And so what's happened here is since 1937, this mob have conserved 5.2 million hectares between Canada and Mexico, and because that's the breeding path of ducks, and it's a series of wetlands. And the better the wetland, or the better the quality of the wetland, the more you are able to charge the duck shooters to come and shoot. They've got 780,000 members, revenue of $250 million, and since 1937 they've raised $3 billion. And there's a similar one for Trout Unlimited. So look, I realise there aren't many duck shooters out here, and there's probably not many trout fishermen and women, but it's just those different ways of looking at things that could come out of the landscape. And then finally here, this was about a risk to the cropping industry, where there was a decline in bumblebee habitat, and they said, righto, what do we need to do to ensure that we've got bumblebees? Because they pollinate, purportedly, 1/3 of everything that we eat. That 1/3 of everything that goes into our mouth is as a result of an insect or a bumblebee pollinating it. And Syngenta, which is a chemical company, developed a pollen and nectar mix. They got farmers to plant it on the edges of their fields, so the marginal areas, not the high production areas where they might be running 2 beasts to the acre over in the UK. They got them to plant them there. Farmers got paid a gross margin of $840 a hectare, which was comparable to growing grain in that part of the world, $340 an acre, and it's been so successful that they've scaled it up throughout Europe. So that's a couple of examples. What have they all got in common? And the common theme, and this is, I had the benefit of going up yesterday with Annabelle in the chopper, and we'd been flying around for, 50, 55 minutes, zipping this way and that way, and she goes, oh, forgot to ask you, did you get airsick? But no, it was all good. So what are the common themes or the lessons learned from all of those that might be applied here? And it's not about the actual solutions, it's about the design of it. So what have they got in common? They were all producer initiated. They all acknowledged that agriculture and the environment can and should coexist. They were all an integrated approach. It wasn't just, we're going to deliver water benefits here at the exclusion of everything else. It was water and plants and animals and food and fibre. They were commercially driven. They demonstrated success. They could measure things. There was integrity under it. It was underpinned by good R&D. They were voluntary. They were flexible, recognising that seasons change and we can't just have a rigid cookie cutter approach. And they all had a triple bottom line approach. So it was good for business, good for the landscape and good for communities. So when I come home, this is home in about late spring, and I apologise that I haven't had time to create one of these for this part of the world, but just bear with me. So Pip, if we can you can hit the next one. So in our landscape, we've got native grasses on the hills, and we've got arable areas where we can crop. That'll include creeks, and so what are the environmental attributes? Creek systems, marginal ridges where I might only run half a sheep to the acre. Yep, we've got some remnant veg here, we've got gully erosion there that we've since planted some trees. Next one. And then in my part of the world, where we're cropping, we've got saline soil and we've got waterlogged soil. So our productivity, there's no point pumping dollars and dollars into that every year expecting to get high yields. Thank you. Next. So back to our attributes: arable, grasses, remnant, gully erosion, marginal ridges. So food and fibre from grazing and cropping with livestock. Water credits might be an ecological good or service is an ecological good and service that we might deliver. It's who's going to pay for that, and New York Watershed would be an example of that. Next one, biodiversity credits. So up here I know within the mining industry you've got offsets. That's an example of one. Over east where there's a lot of development with golf courses and resorts, retirement villages, freeways, gas pipelines, they have to do an offset program. Carbon credits, but the trouble there is sovereign risk. It seems every 2 years we get a different carbon program. So myself, I'm very nervous about contracting to do anything around carbon anytime soon, because it seems to me in the last 10 years we've had about 5 different systems. But nonetheless, that's there. It's just whether is it worth the embuggerance of doing a carbon scheme on your property when and locking into contractual arrangements when the policy might change when we get a ministerial change. And then potentially biofuel crops. Yep. Okay, so just to wrap up, and I think this is where we're having dinner tonight, isn't it? Yep. So this is Coppins Gap. Yep. So to build a program, come up with some solutions that not only enable productivity, but the delivery of environmental goods and services, I feel we need strong leadership, but stakeholder flexibility, underpinned by good science, good economics, good policy, and a heap of goodwill. And I think today and tomorrow is about building those things. We need to recognise that we have to balance production and environmental needs. We have an issue with food security. David, you touched on that one. To get us there, we need to be able to demonstrate success, but landholders need commercial outcomes. As I said, more from less. Well, if we're putting our hands in our pockets to deliver these things, someone needs to pay us for us, because there are plenty of other small business operators out there that if a customer comes to them or a stakeholder comes to them and says, I want you to do this, they say, oh, that'll cost you that. But it seems, there's this psyche in Australia, oh, well, landholders and farmers, they can do it, but we're not going to pay you for it. And a recognition which I'm sure is here in spades, is that sustainable landscapes equals sustainable stations. Thank you.